Okay, so I had this whole opening prepared, tight, clean, and then this morning Dylan, my 16-year-old, was standing in the kitchen when I was trying to get to the BMW, and he said, "Dad, time is a construct." And I said, "So is your allowance." And he said, "Money is also a construct." And I thought, you know what? I cannot have this argument at 7:15 inches the morning when Caroline's tuition bill just landed in my inbox. So, hi, I'm Mike, screenwriter, historian, and man who is apparently raising the next Rousseau, which, I mean, as a warning, welcome to the Mike and Mark History Experience, the show where two middle-aged men who should probably be doing something more responsible with their time spend 45 minutes with the people who shaped the world, ask whether any of it made sense. And today we are talking about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the philosopher who told the Enlightenment to go sit in the corner, the man who helped ignite the French Revolution and never once called for one. That gap between what he intended and what he produced is the dangerous thing about him. It is the gap between lighting a match and watching the building burn.
I'm Mark Irish, English, American. Valerie says mostly Irish, and I've stopped arguing, and I want you to know that I was up at 5 this morning reading at my kitchen table in complete silence, which is the only 20 minutes of any day that's actually mine, and it was excellent. And then I got in the Toyota and drove onto the 405 and counted 17 lawyer billboards in one 2-mile stretch. 17. I was sitting completely still next to a sign that said, in enormous letters, "Hurt in an accident." And I thought, not yet, but the morning is young. In this city, trouble doesn't wait for you. It merges in front of you without signaling and then slows down. Rousseau would have said that is what civilization does to a person. And honestly, he would not have been entirely wrong.
Rousseau would have had strong opinions about Los Angeles traffic. He had strong opinions about everything. That was essentially his job. But we earn the argument, first, the life. Because if you don't understand what happened to this man, the philosophy just sits there like an argument with no body behind it.
Born the 28th of June 1712 in Geneva, Switzerland, and the first fact matters because it shadows everything else. His mother dies in childbirth. Day 1, gone.
Day 1. His father, Isaac, is a watchmaker, romantic, loving, somewhat irresponsible, with a big library full of adventure stories. He reads aloud to the boy all night, which is either the most tender fathering imaginable or a guaranteed recipe for producing someone who spends the rest of his life dissatisfied with ordinary reality.
Both. Definitely both. My mother read me stories every night in Limerick, and I ended up in Los Angeles making television for a living, so the evidence supports the theory.
The family then collapses, legal trouble, debts, Isaac essentially disappears, and Jean-Jacques gets sent to Bossy, a village just outside Geneva. There is genuine happiness there, countryside, freedom, the feeling of the world opening. But there is also the teacher, Mademoiselle Lambercy, who spanks him for misbehavior, and he discovers that it produces sexual arousal. He writes about this in the Confessions with complete explicitness, not confessing it to excuse it, but because he believes it shaped his erotic imagination permanently. The experience installs in him a lifelong masochistic orientation, the desire to be controlled, scolded, subordinated by a woman in authority. When Lambercia realizes what is happening, she stops the physical punishments entirely. He is perhaps 8 years old. He calls his feelings more ridiculous than criminal, which is a revealing choice of words. He is not horrified by the desire, he is embarrassed by it.
And the Confessions deserve a pause here because that passage is the opening move of the whole book, and it announces exactly what kind of document you are reading. Rousseau is not confessing the Lambercier episode to seek absolution. He is saying, this is where I started, this is what it made me, and I am not going to pretend it didn't happen just because it is uncomfortable. Most people, given the choice between honesty and dignity, choose dignity. Rousseau chooses honesty and then explains at length why dignity was always a performance. Anyway, the effect, even now, is that you cannot quite look away. He sounds like someone losing his mind in a group chat at 2 a.m, except with better prose and the self-awareness to know exactly why he is doing it. What he is really doing, I think, is refusing the deal civilization offers. Perform a respectable self, and we will pretend your inner life does not exist. He rejects the deal on page 1.
After Bossy, his formal education is essentially over. He gets apprenticed to an engraver in Geneva who beats him for tiny mistakes. He is a teenager. No mother, no stable father, education cut short, being hit regularly. So he does what a certain kind of mind does under that kind of pressure. He turns inward. Books, long walks, the Swiss countryside. And during this period, he also acts out the Lambertier formation in a way that is both pathetic and, in retrospect, clarifying. He begins exposing himself to women in the streets and alleyways of Geneva. Not aggressively, he describes positioning himself where women might see him and then retreating in embarrassed excitement. What he is soliciting, he says, is not sex, but the reaction, the shock, the scolding, the female authority descending on him. He is not predatory in intent, though the women he exposed himself to would not have experienced the distinction. He gets caught once, nearly caught several times, and eventually runs. It is a strange and uncomfortable episode, and he tells it on himself in full. Then comes the first real crossroads of his life. He is out past curfew, the city gates are locked, and he has a choice. Go back to the engraver and take the punishment, hide in the city overnight and sneak back in, or walk away from everything he has ever known and trust the universe to provide. He picks the third option.
And what strikes me about that exhibitionism passage is how precisely it maps onto Lambertier. The formation is the same, not the act itself, but the female response to the act. The desire is for a specific kind of attention from a specific kind of authority. He is not chasing pleasure in the ordinary sense. He is chasing a feeling that was installed in him at 8 years old in a schoolroom in Bossy. That is a young man who has no idea how to want what he wants and no one to tell him, and the streets of Geneva as his only available laboratory. At 15, and he is nearly 16 when he walks out, that is not teenage rebellion. That is a life split clean in two.
Not quite 16, penniless, and gone. He walks away from Geneva entirely. And the universe, in its oblique, improbable way, sends him first to a village priest, Père de Pontvert, who gives him a hot meal and sends him south to Annecy and a woman named Madame de Warens. This is the pivot of his early life.
He arrives expecting some stern religious figure in grey wool, and instead finds this warm, generous, complicated woman who has left her husband, converted to Catholicism, and is essentially running a one-woman network of patronage and intellectual charity in the French Alps. He is completely undone. Later, he says he wanted to kiss not just her hand, but the floor she walked on. She calls him her little cat. He calls her Maman. He is 16, she is 28. And he is already unmistakably in love with her, not as a son, or not only as a son, which is the thing the script has to say plainly, because Rousseau says it plainly.
Mother, mentor, patron, rescuer, and eventually his lover. That is not a euphemism or an inference. Rousseau describes it in the Confessions. When he is around 20, Maman initiates a sexual relationship with him. He had wanted this and feared it in equal measure, and his account of it is one of the strangest passages in the book. He describes feeling in the moment, not transported but troubled, as though something sacred had been made ordinary. The woman he had idealized as a kind of mother was now also something else, and the two things did not resolve cleanly. He loved her, he was grateful to her. He was also, somewhere underneath, slightly bereft. She puts him in touch with the cathedral choirmaster, Monsieur Le Maître, and opens the possibility that music might actually be his vocation.
And she is not just saintly. She is strategic. She recognizes talent and she places it. That makes her more interesting, not less.
Right. Rousseau idealizes her completely, which means he also misreads her at times. Lemaitre gives Rousseau structure, music, choir life, the flute, the feeling that his talent might be real. Then things go sideways. Lemaitre has a drinking problem, spirals, and his life's work, a box of his musical compositions, gets confiscated in Lyons over a legal dispute. Rousseau, confronted with a man in genuine crisis, panics completely. He abandons Lemaitre sick and broke in the streets of Lyons, runs back to Annecy and feels guilty about it for the rest of his life.
And almost immediately, there is the ribbon. He steals a small ribbon, gets caught, and instead of confessing, he blames an innocent servant girl named Marion. She is dismissed. Her reputation is damaged, possibly permanently. He writes decades later that the Marion incident was one of the reasons he had to write the Confessions. The guilt never leaves him.
Notice what is happening. The boy who suffers abandonment abandons Lemaitre. The boy who knows injustice inflicts injustice on Marion. The wound does not make him better, it makes him human. And the philosopher of inequality is already learning what inequality feels like from both ends of it.
Meanwhile, Mammon goes to Paris, Rousseau is adrift again, and something else starts to emerge. He wanders the countryside for weeks. He soaks in the Alps at sunrise. He helps two young women across a stream and describes it as though he has touched the central mystery of existence. That susceptibility, that naked responsiveness to beauty and feeling would embarrass most people into silence. Rousseau turns it into literature.
He finds Maman again in Chambéry. There is now a business manager and companion, Claude Annette, in the picture, and Annette is also her lover. What Rousseau enters is, by any honest description, a ménage à trois, and he knows it and he accepts it. He describes the three of them living together with something approaching equanimity. Whether that equanimity was genuine or performed for his own benefit is one of the questions the Confessions never quite resolves. He calls the arrangement almost utopian. Annette, to his credit, seems to have genuinely cared for Rousseau and treated him with decency.
And the equanimity may be the most revealing thing. A man with Rousseau's erotic psychology formed around submission, idealization, the maternal finds himself in a shared arrangement with the woman he calls maman and the man she actually prefers. He does not rage. He does not leave. He writes about it decades later with something that reads almost like gratitude, which either means he had genuinely unusual emotional maturity or means he had learned very early to fold his own needs into whatever shape the available situation required. He is not a reliable narrator of his own interior life. He is, however, an unforgettable one.
I want to start with what Rousseau himself called the short period of his life's happiness, because those years matter more than they look. The happiest Rousseau is also the Rousseau becoming Rousseau.
Annette dies, and Rousseau and Mammon rent a cottage called Les Charmettes outside Chambéry, roughly 1732 to 1740. He later calls it the short period of my life's happiness, which is one of the saddest sentences a person can write about his own life. It suggests that everything before was prologue and everything after was aftermath. My mother once said something similar about a holiday we took in Killarney when I was 7. She said it quietly at the dinner table, years later. It landed harder than she meant it to.
At Les Charmettes, he reads constantly Newton, Leibniz, Voltaire, and walks and prays outdoors and absorbs the whole Enlightenment conversation from an Alpine cottage instead of a Paris salon. And his religion begins to shift. He starts as a strict Catholic, genuinely tormented by hell. Gradually, what he senses in nature is not punishment, but presence.
That is one of the great hinge moments of his life. God stops being a judge and becomes something like the soul behind things, not wrath, but presence. And that shift sits underneath nearly everything he writes after. The political philosophy, the education theory, the confessions, all of it has that quiet religious assumption running beneath it, that there is something good at the bottom of things, and institutions bury it.
He says life would be unbearable without God, but he means a different God than the one he grew up fearing. The important thing is where this happens. Not in a famous room, not in an academy, but in borrowed, quiet, while broke and emotionally entangled. The big ideas often start there.
Money, by the way, is still a disaster. Debts everywhere. Rousseau receives a small inheritance from his mother, 3,000 francs, and immediately spends part of it on books.
Of course he does.
Of course he does. Then he hands the rest to Mammon, which is either devotion or financial self-sabotage in its purest form. They get a few genuinely good years out of it, but then Mammon takes a new companion, a young wigmaker named Winston Reed, and Rousseau's fragile peace collapses.
He tries to retreat into being only her son. It does not work. The emotional structure of that household is too unstable, too loaded, too sad.
In 1740, he goes to Lyons to tutor the children of Jean Bonneau de Mably, the Provost General of Lyonnais. This should have been respectable employment. Instead, it reveals once again that Rousseau is spectacularly bad at inhabiting normal roles.
As a tutor, he swings between patience and fury depending on how the lesson is going. He falls in love with Madame de Mably, develops an unrequited passion for Suzanne Serret, and meanwhile convinces himself that the entire system of musical notation needs to be reinvented.
Which he tries to do. He creates a new system, marches it to Paris, and presents it to the Royal Academy of Sciences.
They brush him aside politely, which is often the most devastating form of rejection because it gives you nothing dramatic to fight except your own humiliation. What connects all of it, the tutoring, the passions, the notation system, is the same pattern. Rousseau enters a respectable structure, finds it cannot hold him, and exits, leaving damage behind. Not maliciously. He is not a villain in these episodes. He is someone constitutionally unable to fit the available shapes and too honest about it to pretend otherwise.
In Paris, he meets Diderot and the philosophes. He is suddenly in the center of the Enlightenment world and still somehow the least comfortable person in the room. Brilliant, magnetic, wounded, proud, and always just slightly wrong for whatever space he has entered. The man who will argue that civilization corrupts natural goodness cannot stop wanting civilization's approval.
Then comes Venice. A diplomatic posting under the French ambassador, the Comte de Montaigu. Now, fairness requires saying this. Much of the record here is Rousseau's version, and Rousseau was not neutral where his own grievances were concerned.
That is a very diplomatic way of saying he was capable of carrying a grudge across entire decades.
Correct. Montaigu was aristocratic and contemptuous. Rousseau was proud, touchy, and incapable of absorbing professional disrespect without turning it into a lifelong case study in structural injustice. The immediate flashpoint was salary. Montaigu's pay is withheld by the French government. He retaliates by withholding Rousseau's. Rousseau erupts.
And the eruption matters because it is not just temper. He writes searing letters accusing the whole system of preferring noble birth to merit and character. The insult is personal. The lesson is political. He is not imagining the injustice, he has felt it in his wages.
Exactly. Venice is where Rousseau feels in his bones that intelligence and labour count for less than rank. That experience hardens into doctrine.
Montaigu fires him and reportedly says, "I drove him out like a bad valet." You can almost watch the political philosophy crystallize in real time.
Before he leaves Venice, we also have the Zulietta episode, which deserves more than the polite summary it usually gets. Rousseau visits a celebrated Venetian courtesan. The encounter begins well, and then he notices something. One of her nipples is malformed, inverted. For most men, this would be a minor observation and nothing more. For Rousseau, it becomes a metaphysical crisis. He convinces himself in the moment that she must be diseased or damaged or somehow monstrous beneath the surface, that the imperfection is a sign of something wrong at the core. He goes cold. He cannot continue. He tries to leave. She, understandably, is baffled and then contemptuous. She refuses to take his money unless she has actually earned it. And then she delivers the line of his life. Give up women and study mathematics. What Rousseau reveals in that episode, and he knows he is revealing it, is that his erotic imagination requires idealization to function. The moment the ideal is punctured, even by something trivial, the whole structure collapses. That is not incidental to his philosophy. It is the philosophy in miniature.
She was right. Completely right. Entirely right. And the thing is, she has diagnosed him more precisely than he has diagnosed himself. His erotic life requires an ideal, and ideals cannot survive contact with reality. A real woman, with a real body, with an imperfection, and the whole apparatus seizes. What he actually wants, and what he spends his whole life circling, is not a woman but a condition. To be seen, judged, and found wanting by someone he has placed beyond reach. Zulietta, being a professional, saw straight through to the mechanism in about 45 minutes. He then spends the next 30 years proving that he had heard her perfectly and intended to ignore her absolutely.
Back in Paris, he is defeated, copying music by hand to survive. Then he meets Thérèse Levasseur, a housemaid. She becomes his companion for 33 years, the longest stable relationship of his life.
And then the part that haunts his reputation forever. Thérèse has 5 children. All 5 are sent to foundling hospitals. Context matters. Foundling hospitals existed in 18th century France precisely for families who could not raise a child. That context does not remove the moral weight. Rousseau himself never really pretended it did. He tried to explain. The explanations are not convincing. He knew they were not convincing.
And then comes the irony. Voltaire would later hammer mercilessly. Rousseau writes Émile the Century's most celebrated work on childhood education, a brilliant, genuinely radical theory of how to raise a child with dignity and freedom, written by a man who sent away all 5 of his own.
Voltaire had a gift for finding the exposed nerve and pressing it with one finger. Rousseau knew he was right. That is part of what makes the exchange painful rather than merely clever. It is not wit. It is a wound.
In Paris, he also works for Madame Dupin, gets invited into salons, meets everyone, writes prolifically, dresses as society requires, and keeps finding that he is drawn to the world he despises and despises the world he is drawn to. That internal pressure is about to break open into theory.
Which is what Rousseau does when reality becomes intolerable. He turns the feeling into an argument and then lets the argument hit the world.
Welcome to part 3. This is the lightning bolt moment, the place where Rousseau stops being a fascinatingly unstable biographical figure and becomes the most disruptive philosopher of his century.
1749. He is walking to Vincennes to visit Denis Diderot, who is in prison for his writings. As he walks, he reads a literary journal and sees the Academy of Dijon's prize question: has the restoration of the sciences and arts contributed to the purification of morals?
Rousseau later says that when he read that question, ideas flooded him all at once. He has to sit down under a tree. He starts weeping. He describes 15 minutes of total intellectual ecstasy in which he sees more than he can retain. By the time he gets home, most of it has slipped away.
Which is both comic and tragic. He gets a revelation and cannot carry all of it back with him. Very Rousseau. History gives him a transforming moment and he drops half of it in the road.
The fragment he does hold on to is enough. Human beings are naturally good. Institutions corrupt them. Civilization makes us polished, sophisticated, competitive, vain, not necessarily better. Progress sharpens the tools without curing the soul.
Now, I want to push back a little, because humans are naturally good can sound either profound or deranged, depending on what the person in front of you just did in traffic.
Fair, but I think Rousseau's claim is more precise than that slogan makes it sound. He is not saying people are innocent. He is saying that cruelty, hierarchy, degradation, and dependence are produced by social structures. They are not the deepest truth of human nature. Change the structures, you change the behavior.
That is more serious and more dangerous, because once you believe structures are the primary source of corruption, you start asking what has to be torn down, and that question does not stay in a library.
Diderot hears the idea and says, in effect, yes, write that. Attack. Rousseau writes the discourse on the arts and sciences, submits it to Dijon, and wins. Suddenly, he is the talk of Paris. The essay lands because it says, the thing cultivated society least wants to hear, the arts and sciences may have made us more brilliant and more hypocritical in the same breath.
He even calls the printing press a disaster, which is a bold move when your friend is editing the encyclopedia.
Then Voltaire replies with one of the great cuts in intellectual history. He thanks Rousseau for his book against the human race and says reading it made him want to walk on all fours.
Voltaire was a scalpel.
Rousseau was a sledgehammer. And to his credit, Rousseau later admits that some of the discourse came less from strict logic than from frustration. Frustration with salon life, with performance, with sophistication that felt hollow to him. His nature is not a workable blueprint. It is homesickness dressed up as theory.
There it is. That is the line. He is not really trying to send people back into forests. He is trying to recover something he felt had been lost. Simplicity, sincerity, an unperformed life. The problem is that once you publish that longing at the level of philosophy, other people start asking what stands in the way of it.
Then comes the second discourse, the discourse on the origin of inequality, published in 1755. He does not win the prize this time. He probably does not care, because this is the one that matters more. Here Rousseau argues that natural inequalities exist strength, talent, age, but social inequality is constructed. Rank, inherited privilege, aristocratic advantage. These are not nature. They are history.
And he gives the argument its most famous image. The first man who fenced off a piece of land said, "This is mine," and found people simple enough to believe him he was the true founder of civil society and of its miseries.
Which is the sort of sentence that makes later revolutionaries sit up straighter.
In his defense, he is not calling for everyone to go live in trees. He is saying something harder. The arrangements we treat as permanent and natural are made. They were assembled by specific people at specific moments for specific purposes. And what is assembled can be questioned, and what can be questioned can be changed.
Here is the contradiction, though. Not long after writing that, Rousseau writes an article for the Encyclopedia calling property the most sacred right and defending certain social hierarchies as necessary. He contradicts himself in public, in print, almost immediately.
Which looks like weakness until you realize that Rousseau is not building a clean system. He is wrestling in public with the fact that human beings need both freedom and order, both equality and security, both belonging and independence. He often reaches clarity by colliding with his own contradictions. That is not evasion, that is honesty about a genuinely hard problem.
And out of that collision comes his most influential and most dangerous political idea, the general will. The people as a collective possess a moral authority greater than any individual, greater than any king, and the legitimate state should serve that common good, not the interests of the court or the aristocracy.
Beautiful in theory, terrifying in practice the moment nobody can say clearly how the general will is to be recognized without somebody appointing himself its interpreter.
And Rousseau leaves that mechanism dangerously open. He does not explain the procedural problem. Robespierre later takes the leap. He decides that the revolution knows the general will, and more specifically, that he can speak for it. At that point, political disagreement becomes moral treason. If the people are always right in their collective moral purpose, then anyone opposing the revolution is not an opponent but an enemy of the people's soul.
And that is where the guillotine enters the philosophy. Not because Rousseau called for it, but because he left a door open and history walked through it carrying a blade. He gave a generation the theological structure of revolution, the righteous people, the corrupt order, the necessary cleansing without a mechanism to stop it.
In the 1750s, Rousseau returns to Geneva, renounces French citizenship, reconverts to Protestantism, and builds his political imagination around what Geneva represents to him. A small republic, direct participation, citizens who know one another, a scale of life where politics still feels human and power is not abstract.
Which is also, painfully, the home he walked away from at 15. A surprising amount of political theory turns out to be autobiography with footnotes.
Welcome to part 4, the part where we zoom out and ask what Rousseau actually did to the world. And I want to start with something important. He was not a revolutionary in the literal sense. He dies in 1778, 11 years before the Bastille falls. He never calls for the guillotine. He never openly advocates the violent overthrow of the monarchy. He is trying to transform moral and political assumptions, not write an execution schedule. The distinction matters, even if history did not honour it.
And yet the Durants make the case persuasively. I think that Rousseau, not Voltaire, is the deeper intellectual engine of what followed. Voltaire pushes for reform, better laws, tolerance, justice, limits on cruelty. Rousseau creates a generation that feels morally indicted by the social order itself. That is different. Reform improves the house. Moral fury burns it down.
Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains does not sound like an amendment. It sounds like a rupture. That sentence is not asking for a committee. It is asking for a reckoning. Robespierre reads him that way. He carries Rousseau's books, calls him a prophet, weeps at his grave, and turns the general will into a justification for the terror.
I do not think Rousseau would have wanted that. Whatever his flaws, and there are many, he is genuinely horrified by cruelty, and often most horrified by his own. Marion, Lemaitre, the 5 children. He does not look away from the record against himself. That is not the psychology of a man who wanted a guillotine.
I agree, but history does not require intent in order to use an idea. It only requires an opening. Rousseau supplied several different factions, seized different pieces of him simultaneously. Constitutional reformers, radical Democrats, civic religionists, Jacobins. The same body of work fed all of them because the work itself is full of irreducible tension and Rousseau never tried to resolve it cleanly.
Then there is the afterlife outside politics. The Romantics owe him a foundational debt. Wordsworth, Byron, Shelley, Keats, Goethe. Not just because of the political thought, but because he makes emotional authenticity intellectually serious. The confessions matter. Julie matters. Feeling deeply is no longer weakness. Nature is no longer scenery. It becomes a moral and psychological landscape, a place where the self can be known rather than merely housed.
Modern psychology owes him something too. Freud gets the official credit later, but Rousseau is already insisting that childhood marks you permanently, that society forces masks onto the self, that self-knowledge is necessary and painful and never really finished. He does not have a couch, he has a lake, memory and guilt.
He also has paranoia. In his later years, the suspicion that everyone is against him, Voltaire, Diderot, the philosophes, the Swiss authorities, grows heavier and heavier. He moves constantly. He cannot stay anywhere. Fame arrives, and with it a feeling of persecution that may not have been entirely irrational because some of it was real. He dies at Ermenonville in 1778 without seeing the revolution his thought would help to animate. In a sense, he was spared.
His remains are moved to the Pantheon in 1794. The man who distrusted civilization gets absorbed into one of its grandest monuments. It is exactly the kind of irony he would have both hated and recognized, the institution swallowing the critic whole, preserving him in marble precisely because he can no longer argue back.
So, what does he mean now? My answer is that the specific grievance Rousseau identified, that institutions claim to serve human beings while in practice often serving themselves, is still alive. My daughter Jackson is doing campus activism right now, and I tease her about some of it because parts feel more aesthetic than political. But underneath the slogans there is a real intuition. The gap between what a system says it is for and what it actually does is not a conspiracy theory. It is something most people have felt at a desk or in a waiting room or on hold for 45 minutes with a company that genuinely does not care.
And I would add that we now have measurable versions of anxieties Rousseau only felt intuitively. Loneliness, status competition, the constant performance of identity, the hunger for approval engineered by platforms built to exploit it. Rousseau's fear that society teaches people to live through the eyes of others has become not just a philosophical concern, but a business model. There are engineers right now whose job is to make you feel inadequate, so you stay on the app.
Though I think he would have been horrified, not vindicated, by what happened to the word authenticity. Be your authentic self is now branding language, wellness copy, an Instagram caption over a sunset photo with a quote in a tasteful font. He was asking for something harder than self-display.
Much harder. He was asking for self-confrontation, the kind that does not look good as a caption.
He was a mess. A complete, magnificent, infuriating, courageous mess. He abandoned 5 children and wrote the greatest work on raising children of his century. He believed in human goodness and failed specific humans. He preached against the corruptions of civilization while craving recognition from the very world he condemned. And he did not hide the contradiction. He could have. He chose not to.
He put the contradiction on the page and signed his name to it.
And that is the part that still matters. Not a perfect system. Not a clean ideology. The refusal to pretend he was better than he was. The decision to look at himself and not look away, and then to make that looking into something the world could read.
We live in a world that rewards performance, that rewards the well-constructed self, the managed image, the answer that sounds better than the truth.
Rousseau argued for something harder. He said, look at yourself and do not look away. Do not perform the confession, live it. Do not brand your authenticity, practice it in the dark when no one is watching.
300 years later, we are still not done with that.
And we are probably not going to be. From the Mike and Mark History Experience, tell a friend. Ciao.